If you look at the work of the medieval monks, you will quickly realize that they knew everything there was to know about book production. So much so that when Gutenberg came along and wanted to reproduce these much more quickly, he was able to draw on a rich source of design and layout, and perhaps most of all, legibility. For he copied the quill-made forms that the monks had devised in their scriptorium, the place where they worked, writing their manuscripts. And surely this was the most sincere form of flattery for the work that they produced. Today, with the sophistication of print that we see all around us in libraries like this, the use of typewriters and word processors, we need to rediscover the art of handwriting, the art that can be every man's craft, and with a little care and understanding, be elevated once again to the art form that we saw in the pages of medieval books. The Greeks had a word for it. They called it calligraphy, beautiful writing. So let us in spirit reverse the process that Gutenberg began in Europe and rediscover the process of making our own marks, which bear the imprint of the maker. Pencils come in a variety of hardnesses, and I suppose for general work we use what's known as an HB. But I would recommend that you get a 2B, which we can use later, as I will show you, to transfer designs onto the finished work. And I would also like you to get a 2H or 3H, because this pencil is hard, and when you're ruling up the sheets lightly, you will find that it doesn't wear down too quickly. To take two pencils, to put them together so that they look like the square edge of a quill or a pen nib. And in this way, you can get the experience of using this square-edged tool without the problems of ink and ink flow and maybe the blots. This is rather delightful to use because, in fact, it produces a ribbon-like quality to the work and gives you the first experience of using an edged tool. A good idea is to have a soft eraser, and maybe, if you can get one, a sort of pencil eraser that secretaries use. These are very useful for taking out small errors, particularly if you misspell a word. And then, for those party occasions, particularly if I'm asked to do something which wants to be bright and colourful, I like to play the pencil game with two felt-tip pens. And this particular variety is attractive because instead of being pencil-like in the end, it has a square-edged tip and is like a pen in itself. And if you tape these together, you can produce a bright and colourful effect which reinforces the idea of the ribbon. And to start using ink, I'd like to suggest that you use this particular pen, which comes in a set, and it has a variety of pen widths. And the pen width is important because it will govern the sort of letters and the size, particularly of letter, that you produce, so that if you want to do small, intimate calligraphy like handwriting or large posters, you will be able to do this. And with this set comes the booklet, which shows you a variety of letter shapes which will add colour and interest to your work. And then finally, we ought to consider the dip nib. Now this dip nib is absolutely essential if you're going to use calligraphy with colour. And we will look forward to this because this will enable us to produce an expressive type of calligraphy which responds to the poetry or the mood of work that we're about to interpret. These two come in a variety of sizes, and with a pen holder you will find that you'll be able to use these to produce large and small letter forms. Now with the pen, and particularly with ink, you will need to have a good quality hard surfaced paper which is smooth enough so that the pen will flow easily on the paper. I like to use for general work, particularly when I'm designing, a detail pad. Because the paper is thin, you can put lines underneath, and this enables you, particularly when you're practicing, to follow a grid of lines without the terrible chore of having to line it up each time. You just put the lined sheet that you prepared beforehand underneath, and away you go. Now if you flick through any magazine or newspaper, you will become aware of the bewildering array of typefaces, all of which have really been derived from the pen letter. So, with 2,000 years of lettering to choose from, and 2,000 years of shapes which have evolved, what shape shall we start to look at in order to do lettering? I've chosen one which is 500 years old, and yet it's up to date, modern and contemporary. The scribes devised a compressed hand which they got from an earlier period called the period of Charlemagne. And they did this because it gave them an excellent line length with a great number of words in. And in order to spread the learning, people like Arrighi, Taglienti and Palatino produced handwriting manuals for people to learn from and to copy. The patrons wanted books which were inexpensive to produce. They had to be produced quickly, and yet they wanted them to be as beautiful as earlier manuscripts in order to show them off to their friends. And so this italic hand had to be the best in terms of speed and accuracy, but also from aesthetic point of view, it had to be acceptable and beautiful. I have here a letter dated 1545, and if you look at this you can see that the shapes we can recognize very easily because they have the contemporary flavour of a typeface or even of a written hand, which, although this is written in Italian, speaks to us even today. And because Italy was a land of modern things and Henry VIII liked modern things, Roger Ascham was employed to teach his daughter this new contemporary hand. And I have here a letter written by her at the age of 17, before she was Queen Elizabeth I of England. And to bring this right up to date, and to make a comparison, I have a letter from a personal friend. And he has used these italic forms so successfully, quickly, and yet beautifully. Right, if you have your two pencils at the ready, we'll make a start with your pad. Now it's really very important, if you're going to do a lot of calligraphy, to sit reasonably comfortably so that you don't get tired or cramped. Because later on you'll find that movements of the arm and the hand and the wrist should come easily. And then if you have a light source, if you have this falling over your left hand shoulder, you will see that it doesn't cast a shadow on your work when you're working. But having said that, for the sake of the cameras here, I'm going to break that rather basic rule, and instead of sitting frontways on, so that you can see the picture a little more clearly, I'm going to adjust the angle for the sake of the cameras and suggest that you produce a series of vertical lines. You'll see you'll have to use your whole arm for this, coming down the page. And if we change the image a little, let's think of these as fencing posts. Now it's from these vertical lines that we're going to construct our letters. And although at first it really doesn't seem very much of a challenge, I'm going to turn these now into what might be called a rather square O. And then again, with another slight modification, I've produced an A. Now this shape is rather important in the A, because you remember that they wanted to write these letters speedily, and so they attempted to do it with one continuous movement, and the mark or the point from there to there, producing that line, is really the shortest distance between 2 points. And this is one of the reasons why this particular hand is so speedy. This particular letter, A, belongs to the anti-clockwise family because the movement is anti-clockwise. And if you repeat that movement, you have a D, and a G, Q, a C, an E, and then finally an O. Let me just explain again why the pencil is important. Because it forces you to make large letter shapes, it will enable you to see what the shape ought to be like, and then when you take up your pen, you will find that because there's a reduction process going on, the finer or smaller forms should be that much more clearly understood. If I were to ask you which of those letters you preferred in terms of scale and legibility, I think perhaps you would suggest that this one was the better. This one seems to have too much black for the amount of white space inside, and this one seems to have so much white space that really the whole of that black line just forms a border around it and doesn't really look like an A at all. And this is one of the prime concerns of the monks when they were looking at legibility. They realized there was a sort of balance between the amount of black letter shape and the amount of white inside shape, or counter as it's called. And they found that if they related the thickness of their quill to the height of the letter, this was a good guide as to the sort of or size the letter ought to be. We need to make it about 5 pen widths high, and this gives us the X height of the letter as the typographer knows it. Now at this point, I think it's a good idea to have ruled up a sheet, and this is the advantage of the detail pad, that having put the rulings in 5 pen widths high, I can pop this underneath the sheet and I can see it sufficiently well to allow me to produce letters which are at least reasonably straight and firm. I think it's important to have as much structure and support initially, and later on, when you have the freedom that confidence brings, you can in fact dispense with some of the lines. When Edward Johnson was looking at letter shapes, he tried to see and understand at what angle the pen or quill had been held by the medieval scribe. And in order to get the sorts of shapes we see in the italic, we now need to consider this matter of pen angle, which is going to be held, hopefully always, at 45 degrees. Now, just in case you're not too sure about degrees, 45 or 30 or whatever, if you take a square and fold it in half, this will give you an angle of 45, which we can, in fact, then describe with a pencil on the paper. And if we take the pencil up again instead of the pen, what we're going to do is place the pen, or in this case the pencil, on that, and whatever thereafter the pencil does, we hope that eventually when it returns to the point of rest, it is still at 45 degrees. See if you can find that angle of 45 degrees with your pen, and then maintain it however much the pen moves around the sheet. And this will give you a characteristic thick and thin on the letter, which will give it, in turn, that italic shape and form, which is so characteristic. So 45 degrees. Just to remind you, I will do the palings again, and from this proceed to produce our letters as we saw. So there we have A, and you notice that now I can be free of the constraints of the palings, perhaps, even though I'm repeating the same movements. And rather like motorway driving, the curves are all nicely ironed out for you. I am trying now to move away from the strictures of the rectangular shape and bring to it the flow of a hand, which is a little freer. I see. And the E is made in two parts, so that you have a very definite top or eye to that E, a good counter in there, so that it could never really be confused with an undotted I. Sometimes the pen will behave for you. This one's working quite well, and give you a letter which can be made in one complete movement. But often pens don't like being pushed up the paper. It just depends on the pen and the smoothness of the paper. And so sometimes you may find with large letters that if you do it in two halves like that, that will help. Then let's have a look at the clockwise letters. Letters, for instance, like B. And here, surprisingly, you have a similar sort of pattern emerging, based on that simple rectangle. But this time we're going to go round that way and produce our B. Sometimes it's easy to pull that back like that. So there's two ways of making that B. Then we have the P and the H the M, the N, the R. And it's important, I think, to think about spring when you're doing these letters. They are springy. And the stroke should spring from the bottom, rather like daffodils or any form of growing bulb. It shouldn't really be stuck on like that, but should have a nice sense of growth and lead your eye into the next letter. And so these letters fit together so well and encourage you to read through. I like writing poetry with them because of that lilting or moving quality that they have as they go across the page. Then we have the vertical letters, and you may find that these are perhaps the easiest of all, I'm not sure. Y, and then those strange zigzag letters which I'll talk to you about because sometimes these cause a little bit of difficulty. I think they're initially most easily constructed in that way. Later on you may find that you can, in fact, if the pen behaves itself, push the pen up and down like that, and that does give you a more free-flowing letter. But when we come to the X, you may find that that stroke is a little bit thin. And calligraphers have a number of ways of dealing with this. They put a little top there and a little bottom there, so that those heavier pieces, almost like serifs or finishing pieces, give that letter some weight. Otherwise, you can alter the actual pen angle so that by turning your pen slightly, you get a thicker stroke. And this too you might do with the Z. There. The S. And again, this seems to cause beginners rather a lot of problems. And if you have curves, they move slowly from one into the other. If you produce an S which is all rather curly like this, you're in trouble, because when you enclose a shape in that way, your eye begins to look at the white space inside and says, gosh, that isn't a very attractive shape at all. So keep your S very clean, almost flat top and bottom, with the sort of smooth movement that you would expect to achieve high-speed driving on the motorway. One thing you find when you're writing out the alphabet is you tend to make mistakes because somehow you're on automatic pilot. When my children were small, they used to wonder what it was I taught people, and they used to say, surely, Daddy, they know their alphabet by now. Now, as the pen gets going, you'll begin to see that there's a slight flick at the top just to begin the letter. And this beginning point is called the serif. And it's the nature of the pen to sometimes want to have its nib flexed in order to get it to write, And out of this grew something which we shall consider next. That is the serif. Now let that R rise. I often think it's like coming into a room and you've been away for the weekend and you notice that the pot plants are really wanting a drink of water. So that the leaves are wilting rather. Never let the R do that, as if it too wants a drink, but let it lift and flourish as if it's growing. There's the one sort of X without the change of angle. There's the other sort of X with the change of angle. And I think that Y fits so well with the U that I tend to prefer it to this sort of Y. If some of you are teachers, you'll find that children cope with that sort of Y much more easily, because it really is rather difficult to plot those points, particularly for a young person, to plot from there, through there, out to some mysterious point here, way beyond the letter. There, with a flourish, the Z. This, therefore, is the serif. A little mark first of all, and down into the letter. For formal occasions, like weddings if you like, just as we have good hats, polished shoes and ties, we would like to perhaps implement that by giving it a little formal top. So creating a more formal, a more sturdy, a more conservative sort of letter in that way. Then there's the sort of rolled serif where the letter does that. And you just sweep into it. And then there's another sort which comes down that way and is completed in that sense, rather like the top of the F. While we're on the F, by the way, you can sweep that down and flourish it back. Or you can make it more like a flag serif or a piece of bunting and do that with it. Finish it off to make an H. And these terminations or terminals offer all sorts of possibilities in terms of decoration and embellishment. So the simple serif, that's the beaked serif, the round serif, and then this little flag serif which comes out like that. But do make sure that you have the shapes mastered overall before you worry over much about the decoration. Now these capital letters we get from the Romans. And when they spread their influence over Europe, they wanted to stamp their authority upon the people that they'd conquered, and in the nicest possible way make their presence felt. And so quickly we see inscriptions emerging across the land, particularly in stone, so that they were there literally for all time. And it was a V-cut incision, so that you had the effect of light and shade. And it is from these inscriptions that we get our letter proportions. And unlike the minuscule, where each one seemed to fit one over the other, we have three main proportions of letter. These are wide, based on a circle or a square, something that the specialists call 3/4 letters, or if you like, medium letters, that are 3/4 of their width, of their height in width, and then half letters, which are half their height in width. Let's just go through these. Now the wide letters, letters which need quite a bit of space to perform in, are M, W, O, and I'm compressing the O and rather making them more like an ellipse than a full circle because we're dealing with an italic alphabet. Do you want to get some richness of form into them? We'll call those square letters. Then we have the medium letters. These are A, H, and then the narrow letters or half letters. Certainly I would fit in here, and the friend of the I, the J. That was one that came in medieval times in the margins. It was really an extended I. And because it drops down below, I tend to use a form which maintains the height of the letter, and perhaps some people might say looks a bit like copperplate T, but because that is more in sympathy or in keeping with the rest of the letters, I tend to use that one. Now the P comes down to halfway. Unlike the R, which I might have mentioned and will do later, has a bowl at the top which is rather larger or deeper than the top of the P. Whilst we're on that, we can do the B, which has a deeper bowl at the bottom. Then the S, based on two circles. As we said, don't get it too curly top and bottom. And that, I think, completes that particular set. No, we've left the L out. So there they are, the square or wide letters, the medium or 3/4 letters, and these are the narrow or half letters. Now, the actual height of these will again depend upon your pen, but we will still conform to the idea of the pen width being in relation to the actual height. There's our 5, and for you as a beginner, I think I would make the capital letters 6 pen widths high. Later on, you might find that you've got the confidence to go to 7 pen widths high. But if you do them 6 pen widths high initially, you will find that that won't tax your drawing skills too much. These will improve as you practice. So 6 pen widths high, or later, 7 pen widths, P, W. And we still keep that same angle of 45 degrees, and in so doing, we have a consistency between the actual letter, majuscule letter, and because we're using the same angle, it accords or is in relation to the small or minuscule letters. I'm going to talk first of all about colour, because I think that colour, surprisingly, flatters your work. When you're working black on white, you've got the maximum contrast, and so it shows up all the faults and errors. And I find that at the beginning, you really want something which some people will look at and say, gosh, did you really do that? And so this flattery, to begin with, is helpful for the beginner and even for the calligrapher who's getting on with things. I use designer's colour because I find that this has got excellent permanence, and it also comes ready mixed in a tube. And all you need really is a little drop of this. And this particular colour I'm using is called Sky Blue. I have a liking for cerulean, but that's rather expensive. And another colour that's very useful, very much like the traditional colour vermilion, is flame red. So I'm using Sky Blue and flame red. And you can squeeze a little of that out, and then with some water you can mix it up into a creamy consistency. Cream like you have on the top of the milk, not the sort of clotted cream variety that you have in Devon cream teas. And just by mixing this up so that it will flow through the pen, you can produce a super flat colour. If it's too thin and watery, rather like watercolour, with a sloped board you will get pale colour at the top and a pool of darker tone at the bottom of the letter. Now sometimes you want to exploit this, but if you're doing a formal piece of work and they expect the lettering to be all the same tone, remember, mix it up so that it will flow easily through the pen. You could find that some of the colour picks off on the eraser. And so another thing that I do, and it's a bit like cake making, in that there aren't really very many precise sizes or amounts. I'll put a little drop of gum arabic into that. Not too much, just the amount that appears on the bottom of my brush. And this will cause it to bind a little more firmly on the paper, so that when you do erase the lines, you don't pick up the colour or the colour doesn't come off. Now you know if you've got too much in, because your letters will appear to be shiny and almost like varnish. There would be a tendency from some materials for them to crack off. Now there is another excellent colour which I'm sure you've all been attracted to, but is really not suitable for pens, and that's the Indian ink or waterproof coloured inks. These will clog up in the pen because in a warm room the shellac dries out, and being waterproof it will be very difficult to remove, particularly from the slit in the nib, and it will give you a great deal of trouble. So when we use black ink, do ask for non-waterproof Chinese ink. And then we take these delightful nibs, put one in the holder and attach the reservoir so that the reservoir sits about 1/8 or 3/16 of an inch from the end of the nib, so that if you turn the nib over, it's over the little hole, the V-shaped hole in the back of the nib there. I don't dip. I take a brush, not a good brush like this, but what I call my little grandma's paint box brush, and I fill the pen from the back like that, keeping the underside of the pen absolutely dry. And in this way, the ink flows down the slit in the nib as the nib is drawn across the paper, because that slit opens and closes, and that gentle flexing pumps the ink down to the end of the nib, and we should get then very fine thicks and thins. All we have to consider now is the actual job we're going to do and the layout and the way it's going to appear on the paper. Now I'm going to choose a piece of work, and in this case it's a sonnet by Robert Herrick. This comes from the Elizabethan period, and so it fits in with the idea of the italic. Edward Johnson was always very keen that people actually produced things. There is a tendency for beginners to endlessly practice alphabets, and they can get superficially bored with this and begin to lose their way even by the third letter in a line of letters. And often when I go into school and watch young children practice their letters, you find that the third or fourth one is really quite good, but without any response from the teacher, what happens? They deteriorate from there on in. So you must choose a piece of work that is interesting to you. This piece of work will be as personal as your own handwriting, and perhaps it will be made more easy for you in the choice because you have a friend who would love to have a particular poem or psalm or saying written out rather beautifully, and this makes a very attractive present or personal gift. This one I've chosen because it's quite light and speaks of dress in a woman. A sweet disorder in the dress kindles in clothes a wantonness, and it's called Delight in Disorder. It says something about my studio, I think, too. So how are we going to go about this? Well, take a pad again, and we know because it's a sonnet that it's got 14 lines. And so I can quickly begin to make 14 lines of writing. Now this is what people really call a thumbnail sketch, although this is rather a giant thumbnail. And you can begin to indicate the sort of effect you're going to get with initials down the edge, etc. And then we're going to have a title at the top. Now, you do find that certain shapes are more interesting than others. And I think you'll probably agree that a long rectangular shape like that, or like this, is probably more interesting than something that's square. So, thinking about not just the writing, but the overall effect or the image is important, and you might begin to start with the idea of a particular shape. Perhaps it's going to be framed, and you will see this in your mind's eye before you start. So, in order to make something more interesting, we might consider playing around with the interlinear spacing. That is, the gap between the actual lines. And we can make the gap very tight, or, as in this case, open. And I think this is really like a line of knitting, and the tension or the size of the stitch creates a certain sort of texture. And it's interesting that perhaps the word text comes from the word texture because they create a visual texture. So that's what we're playing around with here as an artist or as a graphic designer. Now another idea would be to put the initials set in this way. So that the line is staggered. And if there's any line difference, and this is marked in some poems, you could in fact use this staggered line to create an interesting pattern at this edge and also balance out an uneven edge just here. Now, what about size of nib? Well, you have to think about whether it's going to be something to look at in the hand or to be held on the wall. And I'm going to suggest that if you want to do something on a wall, that is, a panel to be read easily on a wall, you don't want to make it much smaller than the sort of lettering you can do with a 3.5 or a 4 nib. And begin to write this out, just to see what size it's going to come out like. And that will give me a line length, and after a little while you get sufficient experience to know what sort of length you're going to get with a certain size of nib. Now, I've penciled that out quite quickly, the size that I think that I want, and I've matched that size to a number 3.5 nib, as I suggested. And I'm just going to go over that now, just to see what the nib does to that pencil rough. Now, I'm leaving the capitals because I want to do those in colour. But you may find that, of course, the nib, being an entirely different sort of tool to the pencil, well, could take up more or less space. Now, fitting the letters together in this way is using them really as they should be used. For instance, I think that if you were to put out a set of beads or even diamonds on a table, people would not pay very much attention to them. They would perhaps be even critical of their quality. But as soon as you set those into a necklace or a diadem, using them in the way that they should be used as precious stones, mounted and made up into something which is usable, they take on a different sort of quality altogether. But within the text, they begin to perform the task that they were meant to do, and they take on a quality because of their very togetherness. And we cease to look at their individual faults, which is always a good thing, and begin to see what sort of a pattern they make coming together and texture too. So I'm encouraging you to do a thing in its own right, not because I don't believe in practice, but because I believe that practice can go on in a much more worthwhile way like this. And the practice brings you to the point where you don't have to think with so much difficulty about the actual shapes. They begin to come much more naturally, rather like changing gear in a car. Now, you may think that these simple shapes are too severe and really don't look like writing at all. But once you've mastered those, what you can do is actually do as the writing masters did, draw out the limbs, but keeping that same basic shape which underlie a sort of skeleton on which the fancy ribbons and clothes may be hung. But as you see, the principle is such that you draw out the limbs. Now, these are rather good too if you're involved with book plates, or maybe a monogram for a christening mug. Where there's space, if it's at the beginning of a poem. I'm going to put in the red now, and you can see it's really quite liquid, not so that you can see the bottom of the palette. So that would seem to indicate that it's quite dense as a colour, but it is quite liquid, like the top of the milk. And I'm going to put that into the pen. in that way. And because this was a new nib, it doesn't seem very hygienic, but I've actually licked it. Or if you have a cigarette lighter or a matchstick, you might like to burn off the varnish or the grease that's on there. If you don't do this, it does tend to inhibit the colour. I'll try that on a sheet to begin with. You see, I'm making the pen go backwards and forwards to start the ink pumping down. And now it's beginning to give me nice thins and nice thicks. Now this should be without any pressure at all because of the nature of the pen. I think I decided on the red in the end because the poem itself has a certain passion quality about it. Now I would call this a finished visual or rough. It'll give me a clear idea of where I have to make alterations or adjustments, but at the same time it will give me a clear idea too of where the strengths lie. Perhaps we can do something with that word ribbons later on. And you find that as you work on a thing, the whole process of producing visual things begins to act upon your mind, and you come up and find that from the depth somewhere other ideas come, which sometimes are helpful, and if you seize upon them, you can produce something which is really quite creative. Capitals are difficult to space. They have to have a similar amount of white space between each one. And this will have to be done with a little more consideration when we come to do the finished thing. That's not too bad for a first rough draft. Now, if we're going to spend some time working on a design and then finishing the thing to give to someone, we ought to spend a little time thinking about the sort of papers that are available today to do it on. Because if you do it on a poor quality paper, it will disintegrate. Make sure that the paper you work on is smooth, and then you won't pick up any annoying hairs. And in this respect, you could always check your paper before you start to see that you've chosen to write on the smoothest of the two sides given to you. Now let's look at lining up, which is always a tedious job, I think, and the monks got round it by having quite young novitiate monks to do the lining up for them, and certainly if they stuck to that, they would be happy thereafter in the scriptorium, because whatever else you asked them to do would seem to be infinitely more interesting. Now, there are rules about interlinear spacing, and the rules suggest that you, in order to make everything legible, you do not allow the heads and tails, or the ascenders and descenders of the letters to get tangled up. Ideally, perhaps, you want 5 pen widths for your writing. 7 pen widths will give you enough clearance, because that will give you 3 pen widths for the ascender and descender, and 1 stroke or pen width will allow them sufficient space so that they don't get entangled. And the important thing really to remember is this question of legibility. you're using a pen and ink, and particularly a dip pen, the incline board allows you to use the pen without too much ink pouring off the end. And there's a lovely story told about Edward Johnson, that when he started his calligraphy, he made a board in this way and propped it up with a dried milk tin. And because the students associated every detail with the quality of his calligraphy, they all set off looking for a similar dried milk tin so that they could emulate the quality of his calligraphy in some way, that is. Well, calligraphy doesn't just go on in the studio. Even outside the rarefied atmosphere of the studio, or as the monks would call it, the scriptorium, there are letter shapes and signs to be seen all around. I don't think it's very much good copying medieval ideas. We can learn from them, just as Gutenberg did, but we have to bring verve and panache of the 20th century into the studio. So let's go outside and see what we can see, and what in fact we can press into service.